Ms. Natasha, the Deputy Chief of the Cabinet of the Vice President, Margaritas Chinas. I look forward to hearing from you the latest developments in the policy-making defense of the European Commission. We all know that Natasha Bertaud is very much involved, especially in the policy-making processes regarding asylum and migration of the European Union. The floor is yours, Natasha Bertaud.
So thank you very much, Professor. First of all, let me thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm such an eminent audience of professors. It's really an honour to be here, so thank you. I was reading through all of your policy briefings before coming today, because I was always a good student, but it's also really, really fascinating work, and also listening to you, Professor Sikab, I have to say that I'm very impressed by the very important contribution that you are making to the debate on asylum, and we're listening at the Commission. This debate on asylum, for me, I think one of the most important things, and you actually mentioned it in your speech, is that it is a debate that is a tale as old as time. You know, migration and asylum, these are, particularly from a European perspective, is something that is the hallmark of our common history. You know, whether it was the Huguenots fleeing France in the 17th century, Spanish Republicans in the 30s, not to mention the millions of refugees created by the Second World War, or even after that, Hungarian revolutionaries fleeing to Austria, Czechoslovaks after the Prague Spring. You know, the list I can go on, but the point being that as Europeans, I think we should know, and we would be wise not to forget why giving refuge and complying with the fundamental right to asylum is so important, or why indeed the Geneva Convention was created in the first place. And yet, if you've read a newspaper in the last decade, you'd be forgiven for thinking it's something that we have completely forgotten. I've worked on migration and asylum policies for about a decade now myself. And it always strikes me that it's one of the most emotive topics in policy, but it's also one of the most technically complex. And a lot of that, I think, gets lost in the debate. And the result is that we have very heated political discussions about asylum, and they're often somewhat removed, if not totally divorced, from the reality of the situation, be it in terms even of something so simple as the actual figures that we're talking about can often be conflated, added up, or misconstrued publicly, or the impact that arrivals have on host societies, or indeed the ways in which these challenges can be addressed in practice. And one of the policy papers that I enjoyed reading the most was actually the one on how to gain public support in refugee protection. And if you'll allow me a kind of brief segue on this point, because it's a drum that I personally have been banging for some time now, because I think that one of the issues that we have is also just something so simple as the language that we use, because it seems very innocuous, but it actually can be very, very dangerous. And it's kind of like we are permanently swallowing this poison as if it were water. Take the example of something with the term frontline member states, right? It's ubiquitously used. It refers to EU member states at the external borders, is what it means. But what it's actually using is war terminology, a front line, begging the question, who exactly are we at war with? And the same goes for something like the term illegal migrant, which is used invariably to refer to asylum seekers or economic migrants or whatever. And but even just that term, I mean, our laws talk about illegal border crossings, as in the crossing of a border was done in an irregular or illegal manner. But if we shift that terminology just an inch, and you say you put illegal next to migrant, what you're saying is that the individual is in and of themselves illegal. That not the actions that they've taken, but just their very existence is criminal. And at least in my books, I don't think a person can be illegal. Unfortunately, I think there are many more examples that I could give of this ilk. Some of them have had engendered public backlash. I'm thinking of the term swarm used by a certain Prime Minister whose name I won't mention. But for the most part, these kind of very subtle shifts in language have passed unnoticed. Even, and no shade to it, Julian Triggs spoke about burden sharing. For me, that's something I try very much not to use, because why are we immediately framing the debate in something people looking for international protection are somehow a burden? These terms are everywhere. They populate council conclusions, speeches across the continent. I mean, they even find their way into commission policy documents if I don't get to them in time. It's also not even just the language. Listening up to you, I was also thinking about the imagery that we use to depict asylum policy or migration policy. I remember one of the first things when I started working on asylum policy, I asked our graphic design team, the Commission, to produce a fact sheet. So we need to communicate about this, right? So I was like, please produce me a fact sheet to convey, I can't remember what it was at the time, I think it was the resettlement that we were doing. And the result that came back, again, no criticism to the wonderful communication department of the European Commission, but the result that came back betrayed something that I think is very common. All of the Europeans in these little stick figures had suits and shoes on. The asylum seekers, no shoes, and a little kind of stick with a bag hung over the shoulders. The pictogram for asylum policy was a hat, a hand holding out a hat as if it was a beggar. And I think this kind of shows that we still have so much work to do in order to change just the way that we ourselves picture asylum. And I'm not going to say anything about your choice pictogram here, but I think it is something to be conscious of. So I would very much agree with your assessment that we need to do a lot more to provide counter-narratives, and I would argue that it needs to start from something quite basic, as the language that we use and the imagery that we present. So if there's one appeal I could make to this very impressive crowd, is that please continue to take up every sword that you find in that battle, because it matters, and I'll support you in it. And both of these considerations that I've mentioned so far were very much, I think, at the forefront of our minds at the Commission when we started designing the new pact on migration and asylum. Firstly, the notion that migration is normal. It's natural, it has always existed, and it will always exist. And so it should also be legislated as something day to day. And second, that we need to update the script on asylum, because it's a very multifaceted topic and it doesn't do anyone justice to oversimplify it. The nuances and intricacies of asylum are never going to be captured in a 280-character tweet, but we still have to do it anyway. And the third consideration we had, and this is a little bit, I think, where I have to defend our policy-making choices, or at the very least explain where they come from. It was that for us, we needed to take this, what we call a holistic and comprehensive approach in designing the pact. Because what we had seen in the last years, particularly through the 2015-16 refugee crisis, is that, at least in the European Union, there's no single member state that experiences migration in the same way. Italy does not experience migration the same way as Greece, Germany not the same way as France, Austria, Denmark. Each face very different and unique challenges. But in a union of 27, no one's concerns are more legitimate than anyone else's. So everything has to be recognised, acknowledged, and taken into account. And for the pact, that's what we sought to do, was to find a solid basis that takes everyone's concerns into account, because the wounds that had been opened during the negotiations from 2016 onwards on the revised Common European Asylum System were still very fresh. And our main objective in 2020 was just to bring everyone back around the negotiation table. That's the kind of starting point that we came from. And that meant that for us, we couldn't present a partial picture. We had tried that in 2016. We had presented a series of proposals that were very much focused on a strong solidarity framework, and I think rightly so, in the wake of a huge humanitarian crisis. But we didn't accompany it with these responsibility, not furniture, elements in the form of border and screening procedures. And that is the picture that we were tasked with completing when presenting the pact. Because I do think that an EU pact on asylum would be the ideal, in a kind of pragmatic, realistic way in which we are forced to operate, unachievable, or at least we started 2020 completely unachievable. And it's not a negligible consideration, because I think you said it yourself, Professor, we can write the most solid legislation in the world, but it's not worth the paper it's written on if it never gets enacted. And I also think it wouldn't be enough, because what we saw in 2015 is that we had a crisis that, from a European Union perspective, kind of arrived at our doorstep in Greece, when you had 10,000 people a day crossing over from Turkey. But the impact was not felt by Greece alone. It was felt also by the countries of secondary migration movements, the main countries of final destination, Germany, Sweden. Was the issue Greece itself? No. The issue was actually Turkey, because that's where they were all coming from. Oh no, wait, that's not where they're all coming from. They're coming from Syria. And then, we had to, in the heat of the moment, had to adopt a series of policies, firstly to help Greece, then also the Western Balkan partners, the countries of secondary migration, but also the countries that were hosting millions of refugees themselves, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, to set up resettlement schemes to ease some of the pressure on the reception capacities in these countries, whilst also trying to address the root causes, setting up the Trust Fund for Syria, etc., etc. What we saw is that it wasn't enough to be focusing just on the European Union, and we had to broaden this scope. So what we did with the pact, and what my Vice President, the way he likes to describe it, is that we are trying to build a house with 3 floors. On one floor, we have the external dimension centered around strengthening partnerships with countries of origin and transit. On the second floor, you have external border management. And on the third floor, you have the asylum policies and the solidarity framework that we want to inject into them. And this architecture is very important from a political perspective. Because if you look across the political spectrum in Europe and at our member states' varying positioning, you'll find that everyone is interested in a different floor. There are some people who are quite happy to open the door, go in on the ground floor and stay there and pretend that the other floors don't exist, never take the stairs. There are others that want to walk in, push a button, take the lift straight to the third floor and pretend that the others don't exist. But for this house to say standing, for it to be structurally sound, and you can tell I'm not an architect, what I mean is that for all of these, to get all of these things enacted into legislation, they all need to go together. We need all 3 floors for the house to stay standing. And I'm actually happy to report that this approach is working. Because 3 years after the first of the pact proposals on the table, out of the 13 legislative proposals, so the 19 ones that were packaged in 2016, 2 have already been adopted: the European Union Asylum Agency reform and the Blue Card. Trialogues on the Eurodac regulation are well advanced. The last one took place just last week. The 2018 compromises on the qualifications, receptions conditions, and settlement framework have been reconfirmed earlier this year by the co-legislators, meaning they're essentially ready to be adopted. And the Parliament will adopt its negotiating mandates on all of the rest of the proposals by May, June. And in the Council, we have made a lot of progress on the solidarity framework. There's an outline that has already received unanimous support from the ministers, and we're trying it out in practice with this one-year voluntary solidarity mechanism, which has been in operation since June last year. And the discussions now are focused on what is considered the other side of the coin to the solidarity, is the responsibility elements in the form of the border procedure. And these are advancing at pace. We are now working on to fine-tune some kind of the new ideas that have been emerging in recent weeks, with the objective of ensuring that whatever we do, it has enough flexibility inbuilt so that the member states at the external border are only being asked to do what their capacities allow them to do. And it looks like the compromise that's currently emerging will see a direct and potentially numerical link between the solidarity mechanism and the border procedure, because this is the most politically palatable way for this to be adopted. And I actually think that you don't even have to be an optimist to believe that we can actually get these proposals adopted by the end of this legislative term. And this is no small feat. And for me, also a huge relief, because having worked on the 2016 package and the 2020 package, I don't think I have anything to do a third, at least not yet. So I think we have to bank this optimism whilst we can. But at the same time as we are trying to be the architects of this new and comprehensive framework, the reality is that most of the time we are being called on to act as firefighters. And I think that this will continue to be the case as long as we live in this house that is currently half-built. Half-built because the system that we have was not designed to deal with the kinds of migration trends and patterns that we are seeing. It places the responsibility almost entirely on member states of first entry for the external borders. It has no inbuilt solidarity mechanisms, which for a union of 27, which shares pretty much everything else, doesn't fly anymore. And it's based on this concept that you have one nation state protecting its own borders and managing its own borders, and it doesn't match up to this need to have a European approach. Because, it didn't allow us to deal with 2015-16. We had to look outside of the system to cope, and I mentioned some of the kind of ad hoc mechanisms that we had to put in place. But it's often the case in the European Union that through crises, we often find a way to jumpstart European integration or to charter a way forward. It was Robert Schuman who said Europe will not be made all at once or according to a single plan. And I think that in much the same way as, say, the pandemic shed light on why we need a European health policy, the crises that we have lived in the past decade have also highlighted and brought very much to the forefront of policymakers' minds of why we need a European approach to managing migration. And this is something that has now achieved broad consensus. The European Council met last month in February, and in black and white in the conclusions is migration is a European challenge that requires a European response. And there are two crises that we've already lived through in this mandate alone that have proved this again. One of them was the hybrid attack by Belarus in 2021, and the second was the welcoming of millions of people seeking protection, fleeing Putin's bombs last year, and that continues to be the case today. In the first case, with Belarus, what was happening was a determined attempt to create a continuing and protracted crisis for the European Union and to destabilize our unity and our resolve. And it was a particularly cruel form of threat because it was using people. People were being sold a lie by these smugglers who would fly them to Minsk via several different airports, and they expected to be shepherded practically unhindered into the European Union. Instead, what they found was that they were abandoned in a forest at the edge of the European Union in freezing temperatures of -3. And the European Union, the way in which we reacted was with a great deal of strength. Beyond the biting sanctions package against the Belarusian regime and the strong humanitarian action to evacuate people from that forest, we also went around the world building a global coalition against the practice of instrumentalization, and invented the word instrumentalization, by the by. So we were able to stop all of these flights that were transiting to Minsk, because they weren't going directly to Minsk, they were going through Dubai, Tashkent, Ankara, wherever you will. And we were able to do this, firstly, because we took a European approach, what we have now coined the Team Europe approach. It was this unrelenting alignment of EU member states and the institutions that serve them, showing that when we act united, we are an inexorable force. And we were also able to stop these flights because the threat that we made of sanctioning airlines was a very credible one. It was because President von der Leyen stood on the lawn of the White House and said, we are going to enact a new legal framework which will enable us to adopt targeted measures against transport operators that engage or facilitate in smuggling or trafficking of people into the European Union. Turkish Airlines did not stop what were actually quite a profitable number of flights because the reason they stopped it was because they have a multi-billion-dollar stake in the European Union's air market. So the threat was credible. In the second case, with Ukraine, I think it's again a united European response that has proven us able to manage and mitigate this crisis. Saturday just gone, marks the 1-year anniversary of us triggering the Temporary Protection Directive for the millions of people fleeing from Ukraine. There are now, to date, 4 million people who are beneficiaries of temporary protection in the European Union. And I think it's to our collective credit that we have been able to manage these unprecedented arrivals. But we were also only able to do it because of this legacy piece of legislation from the 90s. And actually, under the pact that we have proposed, in the original proposals, we proposed to repeal the Temporary Protection Directive. In the Crisis and Force Majeure regulation, it would repeal temporary protection. And this made sense at the time because it was essentially a defunct instrument that was designed to address a kind of Kosovo-type situation that has never occurred since. And so it had never been used, and it hadn't proved terribly useful to us. We weren't able to use it in 2015 and 16, although we would have wanted to, but it wouldn't have been fit for purpose. And we couldn't have imagined a purpose where it would be fit for, because we didn't anticipate the Ukraine situation. But when it occurred, we were very fortunate to have this piece of legislation in our pocket. But it's also, in itself, not a perfect instrument. And we've seen this now, trying to implement it over the last year. There's a lot that is lacking. Even something so simple as data collection is not foreseen by the directive, meaning that we had to create a new temporary protection registration platform within 6 weeks so that we could detect double registrations within a member state or across member states. And this directive, it gives immediate access to healthcare systems, to education systems, to the labour market and to housing. But it's one thing having those rights, it's another giving life to those rights in practice. And so over the last year, we've had to adopt a long series of flanking measures to help give life to these rights in practice. And on Wednesday, the college will come out with a report looking back at how all the measures that we've tried to take and continue needing to take to make this directive and this concept of temporary protection work in practice. because there's also very little solidarity provisions in the Temporary Protection Directive. And in fact, it only works because member states agreed to just not apply one of the key articles of the directive, Article 11. They just waived it, which means that people can essentially could choose where they would like to receive temporary protection and in which member state they want to receive it. And even then, that's only possible, this self-relocation of people across the European Union, because Ukrainians have visa-free status. So there was no barriers to them travelling within the European Union. But this has still resulted in a strain on the reception capacity of some of our member states and an uneven distribution of beneficiaries across the Union. So I think 1 year on in this temporary protection experiment, there's a lot of lessons that we still need to draw. There's a lot of lessons that we still need to draw for the Pact as well, and for these discussions on the articulation between the crisis regulation that we proposed and the solidarity mechanism under the Asylum and Migration Management Regulation. What is clear from, at least from a Commission perspective, is that we need to revise our position a little bit on the repealing of temporary protection, and this is what we will say in the next days, is that we think it is something that needs to remain part of the toolbox that we have available to us in order to manage migration and asylum in the future. But in both of these kind of firefighting instances that I've mentioned of this mandate, I think the overarching lesson for us has been, firstly, that a European approach is the best and only way forward. And second, that we're most effective when we are grounded in EU law. Meaning that, again, the takeaway for us is that the clock has run out on how long we can continue to live in this house that is half built on our asylum and migration policies. Because for as long as we don't have the proper architecture in place, we're going to continue having to improvise our response and have these ad hoc solutions to immediate problems. That said, we continue to be both architects and firefighters at the moment. In February, the European Council leaders met, and we came forward with a series, the Commission came forward with a series of operational measures of how to tackle some of the issues that we are facing in the short term until the new pact is in place. So we have things that we're working on at the moment. We have 2 tailored action plans to take a kind of whole of route approach and look at migration along the Central Mediterranean and Western Balkan routes. We've also been asked to produce action plans on the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Mediterranean routes, so those are also in the pipeline. We've been redoubling our engagement with partners worldwide to increase readmission and to bring about increased visa alignment. This was something that was particularly acute in the Western Balkans just before Christmas, where we saw that the visa policy, or the lack of alignment of the visa policy with the European Union, was leading to increased figures along the route. We're also working to continually improve our situational awareness of migration trends. And we're working now on a new pilot order procedure to showcase good practices on border procedures in kind of the same way that we're doing with the voluntary solidarity mechanism. We now want to do with the border procedure, test it first in practice, build support for something that can actually work and is proven to be beneficial to the member states using it. And we are also, next week, we will also come with a recommendation to member states on how to streamline the return procedures internally. And we are stepping up cooperation on search and rescue, something that has an issue that has again been thrown into stark relief by the tragic sinking of a ship off the coast of Calabria a few weeks ago. And we are concluding anti-smuggling partnerships with, now we're looking at Tunisia and Egypt, following on from the ones that we agreed with Morocco, Niger and the Western Balkans last year. And later this year, we will come with 2 new proposals, one for an EU talent pool and another for the recognition of qualifications of third country nationals in order to foster legal migration, something that our continent still desperately needs. And so we are, as policymakers, living in between European councils. We have until the 23rd of March, the next time the European Council meets, to kind of take stock of these operational measures, and there is a reporting expectation on us at the Commission. But of course, it doesn't take away the need for structural solutions, and it continues to be the case that and the case that we're defending is that only a major renewal of our legal framework can offer the strong and sustainable foundation for action that we need. But maybe I can end on this point, is that I would, kind of in defence of the Commission's proposals on the pact, I think we also need to be conscious that, and we are very conscious that we're not trying to rebuild the Parthenon. You know, we are not aiming at the perfect asylum system. We are aiming for one that is better than the one that we have today, that promotes, that is more European, that shares the responsibility amongst member states as it should. And I often think that we kind of have, at least as Europeans, this tendency to be quite self-flagellating, like quite pessimistic about the things that we are doing. But this is one area where I think we are making progress for the first time in a long time. And so a lot of it we can be proud of. There's still a lot of work to do, which is why it's so important the work that you are doing, because we often, as I said, we're busy being firefighters. It's very hard to be an architect at the same time, so we need you to be telling us how it could be better. But in the meantime, we still have to struggle with this, the challenges that we face on a day-to-day, because public opinion is fickle. Politics is short-termist. I remember 19th of April 2015, 700 people lost their lives on the boat off the coast of Lampedusa. The immediate reaction in public opinion was overwhelming support. Fast forward 2 months later, and local communities were setting fire to refugee camps. So public opinion is fickle. But the politicians and the political parties that we're working with are also seeing things in the short term. These are the challenges that we have to face. And so the comprehensive approach that we are trying to take, I hope you forgive us for it, but it is the most pragmatic way and the most realistic way that we consider we can actually make a difference. And the argument that we continue to make, and that's the note I'll end on, is that we have so much to be proud of in this union, with the second largest most regulated market in the world, with the second strongest currency, with champions of human rights, privacy, healthcare, education, you name it. But there's one area where that European approach is still lacking, and I would say it is on having a real common asylum policy worthy of its name and befitting of the values that the EU so readily embodies.